enough. Wow, much farther back. Truth, Beauty, Goodness. So notice one of the books that I used was by Willard Van Orman Quine and the co-author J.S. Ullian. What happened was Ullian asked Quine, Ullian was a professor of English at Harvard, and he asked Quine, could you help me write a book for English classes that would explain current philosophy? And so the joint effort was The Web of Belief, which you could actually go on to, I guess the easiest, instead of looking for my link, you could just go Quine Web of Belief. And of course, they still advertise the book. You can still buy the book, but it's actually on the web. In fact, these are obviously a web, right? You know, a web of belief. How our beliefs are kind of like a web where, you know, as you learn new exciting things, it kind of does this to the web. You know, like the spider, oh, there's something with it, right? But if it's significant enough, it could actually change the actual center of the web. And so that's, in a sense, the way our beliefs change. You know, they have to be pretty drastic for us to actually change one of our core beliefs, etc. So pretty interesting, and it's actually one of those sites out there. Oh, PDF, there it is. I should have thought of that. But you can actually find the whole text on the web, or if you're curious, you could go and buy an actual copy. There might still even be copies in town, although it was years ago that I used that as a required text. But that one is the only book that he ever wrote that is readable by someone that's not immersed in predicate logic. In fact, this was, you know, a personally exciting thing for me. I ended up with 2 of Quine's grandchildren in class. Did I tell you that? Was that part of what I mentioned?
You never mentioned it.
Never mentioned it. One of his daughters married a guy named Roberts, who for some reason ended up living in Anchorage with his family. And so their grandchildren, a couple of them, grew up here in Anchorage, came to UAA, and took me for philosophy. And we're sitting in my class when I covered their grandfather. And they were like, you know, I can't believe you're covering my grandfather. And, you know, because you grow up with a person like that, it doesn't occur to you that your grandfather could actually be famous in circles that, you know, well, maybe you're not in those circles. In fact, since at that time I had a term paper requirement, and I said, you know, you could do your term paper on your grandfather. And she was like, nah. That semester, though, it was one of her friends did do it and actually interviewed her mother asking about what it was like living with Quine. And the mother said, he wasn't really a very good father, because unless you wanted to talk in, you know, predicate logic, he wasn't there for you. You know, that was it. You know, he didn't like talk about other stuff, you know. So, you know, not a really good childhood as far as their relationship with their father was concerned. So that was kind of an interesting thing that, by the way, I don't see in any of the literature on him. So that's pretty cool. But this book is highly readable. I'm sure that Ullian had a lot to do with that, actually. But some of the books were quite significant. Word and object, you know. We've got a word here. How does it refer? Right? You know, we were already looking at that with Bertrand Russell And if you saw the video on Wittgenstein and that issue, how do words refer to things? Definite descriptions. I did a whole term paper on how definite descriptions refer. It was important, when I was in school. But now we're into sets and other things associated with sets. So if you're looking, for example, in European philosophers that are, one of them is still alive, one of them just died recently, Bruno Latour, just recently died of cancer. And I suppose this is kind of an interesting aspect of the difference between European philosophy and American philosophy and British philosophy. You really should stick those two together for the most part. The English-speaking world versus Europeans. And that is the idea of what a set is, and how we can talk about things in science. How science at the level that it is, and the way particles are, and even sheep. I mean, you name it, anything you pick. How do we consider that a set that we could describe, by its characteristics? And considering that there's so many different characteristics, etc. Look at our cultural issue right now with regard to male and female. If you think about it, it's essentially that kind of set-defining issue. Who is male? Who is female? What if you have this characteristic? If you have this characteristic, does that make you, if you have two X's, that makes you a male. If you have, two X's is female. Thank you. I'm okay. I didn't even have any alcohol last night, so there's no excuse, right? I was just water. I was so dried out for some reason. We're two X's is female, an X and a Y is a male. What if you've got two X's and a Y? Or what if you've got one X? I had a student, actually I never had her as a student, or I never had it. Them? Okay, them. As a student. It's actually a syndrome, and people didn't used to live when they only had one, but I'll call her a she, because she identifies most of the time as a she. She only had one chromosome, an X. So theoretically, she's not a complete woman. And in fact, she needed all sorts of medication as she was growing up, or she would have been like the precursors who had that and died. But she actually is still alive, has a PhD, and multiple other degrees, and no one will hire her for anything because she is weird. Not weird the way that's a different set of weird than,
Socially weird?
Yeah. I mean, you're in that set where you're going to be hired wherever you go.
Oh, okay. No.
She's in the set of weird where, people walk in and they, we'll call you. That's, okay. So sets turned out to be a dilemma. And his concern is, how does science deal with sets? And, so he's dove, past tense, into all kinds of situations where I remember him sitting on the top of Mount Blanc with a bunch of other students, all analyzing, I think it was snow, or little creatures that lived in the snow. And they were trying to figure out, how to define the different sets of the kinds of life that were there. So that was kind of the way he was working. But his main concern was Gaia. He called it Gaia. And the reason that he won the Kyoto Prize was because of his work in that field of how we have to change the model that we have of the universe if we're going to prevent Gaia from being destroyed by the way we're doing things. So for him, instead of thinking of the Earth as the whole Earth, what we have to think of as Gaia as that thin little ribbon of atmosphere around the surface of the Earth. That's our ecosphere. We're not able to live in the middle of the Earth or even in, a mile below. We have to live in this thin little, roughly 3 mile, 10 mile, or it depends on where you are on the Earth. We're closer to space here in Alaska than if you live in Philadelphia, because the atmosphere is thinner here. Which is also why, by the way, if you live here, you're really at about the 4,000 foot level atmospheric-wise, right? Because how thin the atmosphere is, right? You go down further in the middle of the Earth, the atmosphere is thicker, and you have more air pressure, et cetera, right? We're thinner, but we have less air pressure, so being on the top of Mount Denali or Mount McKinley, or the big one, the one that you could see from my driveway, actually, is much more difficult breathing-wise than on Mount Whitney, for example, in California, because of the thinness of the air, even at what you would call, you couldn't actually be at ground level anywhere near McKinley because of the way the terrain is. But it's much thinner there, and so it's a very different situation for you that way. Another Frenchman that's interesting is, and this one is still alive, Alain Badiou. His English really is much worse. If you watch YouTube, there's plenty of YouTube videos. That's a neat thing about a philosopher that dies. Like Quine is dead. You could go on and watch the videos and see him and hear him. That's pretty darn neat. Badiou has videos out there. He's still alive. And his big book is Being an Event. And what he means by event is the current set of things in a particular situation. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to describe the predicates of a particular set of things in this particular situation, etc. And that's kind of a chain. Remember, Hegel in his logic talks about being and nothingness, as kind of two sides of what creates, the dialectical process, both, right? And that goes on. Heidegger has being and time. Sartre has being and nothingness. That's actually the name of it. Zizek, if I think a couple of you were interested in Zizek, that would have probably been overwhelming, but that doesn't matter, remember, because you only need 3,000 words. They don't have to make sense for the term paper. And that's really but Zizek's book was less than nothing. So you get all these folks talking about, being, and that, here's being, what is being? And then you get, their attempt at trying to explain the importance of what being is and what it means and how we can basically understand it. His is being an event. So what we want to do is understand the characteristics of specific events, and through sets, really. Well, the trouble with European philosophy for most Americans today is that they really rejoice and dive in and enjoy the difficulty of believing that a thing is not only what it is, but what it isn't. And the conflict between our descriptions of things. They're very aware of how language is an absolutely incredible tool that gives us all of these amazing powers as human beings, but at the same time is misleading because you describe something one way and then you realize, but that's not all the ways that it is. There's other ways to view things. So it is this way, but it isn't that way. And that becomes very logically confusing if you prefer to see things kind of in a black and white way of viewing things. Europeans don't have that tendency. They're much more interested in enjoying all the ambiguity and weird ways of looking at things. In fact, the more off-center you can look at something, the more it seems to be interesting to Europeans, right? But when you look at Americans and how English speakers pretty much deal with this situation,